Joining me now is Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu. Happy New Year, if we can say that, given the circumstances, Minister, but good to see you and hope you and your clans are well. Let's get right to this, if you don't mind. Why is there, the $40 billion settlement, $20 billion and $20 billion, I understand that. We talked about this in the end of last year. What's missing here is there's no timeline in place to compensate First Nations children and families. This is a non-binding agreement. When will people actually see the details and know when they're going to be compensated?
Well, first of all, I have to thank all the parties that worked so incredibly hard over the last 6 weeks to get to this historic deal. It's a signed agreement in principle. All parties have signed on, and you're right. It splits the work into two buckets, if you will. One on compensation for harms for Indigenous children, First Nations children that were removed from their homes or experienced discriminatory services. But the second bucket on reforming the system and putting enough money into the system for that long-term reform to make sure this doesn't happen continuously to children in the future. So on the compensation, this will be work ahead for First Nations leaders and communities to determine the best, safest, and most equitable way to compensate people. Of course, we'll be there as a partner to make sure that that work has the support it needs, and we'll be there to mobilize the resources as they're required.
Like again, Cindy Blackstock's reaction, and she's going to join us on this program in a minute. Her big question is when? Like, this has got to happen. So why is there no timeline as to say when will people know what the timeline on compensation will be?
Well, I will thank Dr. Blackstock and indeed all of the other parties who insisted that the compensation regime be done in a thoughtful way through First Nations leadership. Those conversations will continue over the next months now to make sure that a process is put into place that is fair, as I said, that does acknowledge the kinds of harms that people experience, and most importantly, I think, doesn't re-traumatize individuals. We saw in previous compensation regimes, whether it was for residential school survivors or other kinds of situations where people were actually traumatized by the process of having to apply for that compensation. And I think we've learned a lot as a country, but certainly I think one of the most important ththings we've learned is that these kinds of regimes need to be designed by First Nations people to make sure that they're done in a culturally appropriate and culturally safe way.
Now, she's saying it's the government's job to, quote, land the plane. So
I think it's all of our jobs to land the plane, and I think Dr. Blackstock, as a signatory to the agreement in principle, has put in a number of important contributions to the agreement, as have, for example, Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse from Anishinaabe Aski Nation, who talked about the need for remoteness quotient considerations, and of course Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse, and of course the representatives from Chiefs of Ontario, and the class action litigants. This has been an ongoing, and I would say very robust conversation facilitated by the Honourable Murray Sinclair, as you know, who has been incredibly helpful in making sure that we stay focused on what matters, which is obviously the wellness of First Nations children. Okay,
the other second bucket, as you call it, the agreement in principle, includes $20 billion for long-term reform of First Nations Child and Family Services Program. Apparently, this will be implemented, according to the government, April 2022. Concrete timeline, and like what exactly will be implemented by then? How does $20 billion get allocated? I know it's over 5 years, by April 2022.
Well, April 2022 is when we'll start to see some of those changes take effect. And in fact, these changes, again, will be determined by First Nations leadership, First Nations Child and Family Services, and in partnership with provinces and territories, of course, who hold the pen, if you will, on some of these changes. And you know that we've been working diligently with those provinces and territories to change the face of child and family services across this country through C-92. But listen, this is a work in progress. It will mean equitable funding for services like Jordan's Principle. It will mean that communities will have adequate funding. It will mean that communities will be able to fund programs and services like Choose Life, which is a homegrown First Nations developed suicide prevention program that unfolds in different ways across Northern Ontario. That will be expanded to communities that wish to use it across the country. So there's no one answer, Evan, to this work, but there is certainly a number of incredible examples across the country.
Can you tell people how many people is it? There's numbers that we've heard from the AFN that this will impact 200,000 kids and their families. How many people will this impact, the compensation? And how did the government come up with this $40 billion figure? Like, where does that figure come from?
Well, we've used actuarians. We've used a variety of different experts and methodologies. As I think Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse said so eloquently, we've used math and science to determine exactly what compensation should look like and what will be enough to actually cover the compensation needs and the long-term reform needs. This government's committed to making sure that people are compensated fairly, obviously, but I think, again, that a long-term reform, that is the real game changer going forward for families.
Okay, just a couple things. Am I right to say this is 200,000 kids?
Well, that number is, listen, there are estimates of kids. It's well over 100,000 individuals. It could be more than that. Again, we don't know the size of the class because, of course, some people, and I will just speak from personal experience, some people will not even know that this deal has been concluded, sadly. I mean, people that I worked with in the community of Thunder Bay, many of them who had been traumatized, multiple, up to 15, 20 foster homes, oftentimes completely disconnected for their communities. So there will be work ahead to make sure that everybody who's entitled to compensation knows that they are and gets that compensation.
Okay, so that number can change. Just two last questions real quick. The floor, in other words, the minimum compensation is $40,000. That's what the Human Rights Tribunal talked about. What's the maximum for this government? You've got $20 billion for compensation. Are there figures that we know? Will some people get hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and some get 40,000? How does that work?
Well, again, that's the process that needs to get worked out now that we have an agreement in principle. The $20 billion is there. We don't have a set ceiling for individuals. First Nations leaders and organizations will help to determine how that compensation unfolds in a fair way. Some people will be, obviously entitled to more depending on their harm and their particular circumstances.
But is it the individual, like, again, because remember in the original case, in the federal court, the judge said that it is not, when they ruled for the Human Rights Tribunal, it was not for individuals to have to fight for individual compensation. So does that mean an individual says, okay, I know 40,000 is the floor, but my experience was X, Y, and Z. I'm now going to get a lawyer and fight for more compensation. Is it now up to individuals, or will there be, this is your possible, areas where you'll get compensated, or do now individuals have to fight for their own compensation?
I think what we want is a system that doesn't make people fight for compensation, that doesn't re-traumatize people in the process of compensation. And that's why it's going to be so important that Indigenous people design the compensation framework. Many of the people that will work on this have lived through previous compensation regimes or witnessed the harm that those compensation regimes have inflicted on individuals. I personally have met and talked to people that, suffered extraordinary harm and abandoned claims through the independent experience process. If you remember, independent experience process, that was part of the residential schools process. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding and duplicating those kinds of extremely damaging experiences, and that's why the First Nations leadership is so important in this work.
Just finally, is there a situation that could see the federal government again back in court over the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling, or a class action suit, or does the class action suits get dropped now? And does this all do away with the legal challenges now?
Well, I think there is a process whereby once we reach the final agreement, we do need the blessing of the federal court and the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to make sure that we've met the expectations of those bodies. But yes, this is the actions of a government that does not want to continue litigation. This is the actions of a government that understands we need to move forward in a way that respects Indigenous self-determination over children, respects equity, and pays the bill that is owing to Indigenous families that have been so dramatically harmed.
Okay, lots of details to come, but again, $40 billion is a big number over the next 5 years, and $20 billion over the next year and a bit. Minister Hajdu, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Evan.